Alrighty. Hello there, everyone. We are now back with the XenoArchive Podcast. I am currently by myself, because Dark is off playing some Mario Party. He's allowed to do that. I'm just making a comment about it. So, I suppose we can go ahead and get ourselves started. But, how are all y'all today? Hope y'all are having a good day. Yes, Montar, surprisingly, my mods are allowed to play Mario Party without me. But, you know. So, we are here, and we are here to discuss shenanigans. I have something to kind of keep my throat going, hopefully, maybe. But, so, last time we talked about kind of the general, idea of how advanced / not advanced technology is in the Xenoblade 1 world, but specifically amongst the Homs. Because that's a very hilarious point, and something to probably kind of touch upon later going into, like the differences between that and High-Entian and the lack of technology for the Nopon, and possibly get into how it differs from Alrestian, but point. Also, hello there. This time, specifically, I wanted to touch upon the differences or similarities or whatever between specifically Xenoblade 1 with the Homs and what is generalized kind of, accepted as we are human. Possibly also kind of getting into the difference of, Homs versus Alrestian human, because that's also a different point. So, much like the last episode, this is definitely spoiler territory. I'll be going into things from the actual Monado archives. The usual, I've done my research sort of thing. So, I guess kind of the main thing that's going to start this out is we know from a physical standpoint, looking at the characters, that very much a Homs is based on a human. Like, it's in the name, they, follow same criteria as to what they look like. That's even a common misconception, quote unquote, I see for people not familiar with Xenoblade, that they just say Shulk is human. Which, again, I do not blame them if they don't know the series. But it is one of those things that I consider, well, what exactly makes him different? Because I bring that up in, my own, like, writing and stuff and the occasional look at stuff. What actually physically separates them? Also, thank you, stream, for changing the title back for no reason. Give me a second. Don't you just love it when Twitch is just like, I'm going to randomly change the name of your stream, even though you changed it twice before you started? Yes, that is kind of a point, that just because they are based on human does not necessarily mean they are human, especially in their own language, culture. They call themselves something different, because that's even a thing in, like, most other games. That's like, oh, this is not Earth, blah 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 blah. They still refer to themselves as human. Like, the fact that they are specifically called something different is already kind of a hint that they are technically non-human entities. They're close enough. Like, you take Shulk and you throw him into frickin', like, Persona 4, and it'd be like, yeah, he's human. They wouldn't bat an eye at him. Yeah, I'll get into that, but, like, I guess to kind of start off, the similarities, or things that we know that they have that would be like, if a Homs existed, be like, yeah, that's human. So not everything gets brought up biologically in the game because, there's not much point. But we know that they have regular cardiovascular system, that physical makeup is the same. It's already confirmed through item descriptions that, they have livers, they can process alcohol in some capacity. That they have generalized height diversity, skin color diversity, the usual aspects of that is what defines humans. And that's one of those interesting things that, like I said, they don't get into the intricacies, so it's like a lot of questions get brought up on what exactly makes them different. And I think one of my favorite things that technically you don't pay attention to, but because it's subtle, is the fact that apparently Hom's eyes are very different from human. In the fact that it's hard to tell in most renderings, but there's like a really, really good picture of Shulk, like a close-up of him holding the Monado, and it's a bit more prevalent with like Melia, but Hom's eyes have rings to them, like other than just the standard color of the iris in their eyes. They actually have rings to them that discern certain parts, and I think I saw somewhere that it was specifically described as rings of ether. So, like, Shulk has bright blue eyes, but there's just a ring kind of in the middle of them that is slightly darker. And, like I said, it's more prevalent in Melia, where she has also very bright blue eyes, but she has more rings, I think she does. And I think the only other character that you could really tell with is Sharla, because I don't remember for Fiora specifically. And then, in terms of their models and stuff, Ryan and Dunban have very small irises, so it's hard to even discern like the color, which it turns out I thought for years that Ryan had brown eyes, but no, they're gray. And same thing for Dunban. They both have gray eyes. Little fun fact. So it's kind of hard to discern with that. But then another one of my fun little things that I've learned is, now bear in mind, you have to take some account of video game development with this one. But one of the fun little things I've learned through playing the game is that the height of the Homs has a different average, kind of, compared to humans. Like, obviously, we have a much larger scale to kind of go, this is a average height for a person from X country. Do bear that in mind for statistics as well as game design. In Xenoblade 1, we have listed heights for every one of the main party members, and it's in centimeters, but easy to convert. Shulk is like 5'7", Dunban's 5'10", Fiora's 5'2", Sharla's 5'5". Actually, I think she's like 5'6". Melia is 5'2", and Ricky is very tiny. And Ryan's like 6'3". So there is that to bear in mind. And comparatively, if you were to take any of the Homs characters and measure them up against random NPCs, the girls are close to usually the same height of most female NPCs in the game. Bearing in mind specifically Homs. High Inti are a completely different ballgame. Nopon are Nopon. So when I say NPCs, I mean specifically the Homs. The girls are of similar height, and then for the boys, with some exceptions of like Juju because he's 13 and Atharon because shrug emoji. The only one that usually matches up to height of NPCs is Ryan. Dunban falls slightly below the average height of an NPC, and Shulk is just short. Like, despite the fact that in reality, Shulk's 5'7" would be considered pretty normal or average, and then Dunban and Ryan would be considered somewhat tall. Shulk, in all honesty, for a Hums, is kind of short. Like, he's closer to the average of a female height compared to any of the male NPCs. And I am meaning in terms of, like, just trying my best to get the camera close enough and within a certain perspective and blah, 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 blah. But there is the point that most NPCs of Colony 9, which I use for reference, are taller than most anyone else. And Chulk is in weapons development instead of defense force. Well, that may be some factor, but considering they do have women in the defense force, I don't think height is their big issue, especially since Atharon is shorter than Shulk and he's the colonel of Colony 6. I don't think height is a big factor. I think recruitment of the defense force is anyone willing and able. But as long as, they don't have two people of the same family, I think is a big thing usually. Though I don't think that completely excludes them, because Fiora was considered for the defense force even though Dunbane was already in, but that's a different topic for another time. But the point stands that, I measured, or at least I tried my best, because, animations and stuff. So there are, older Homs in Colonies 9 and 6, specifically, Dionysus, Jan, and Cheryl. Yeah, at least for 9. And the thing is that if you manage to catch them standing up, Dionysus is, about the same height as Rhine. Or, even slightly taller. So, bearing in mind that all things considered, we don't know if, Rhine and Shulk are done growing, based on future connected. Shulk, definitely. But point stands that, Hom's height is kind of more of those things that it's hard to pin down. But thinking about it from the perspective of the actual in-game lore, it makes a lot of sense, frankly, that Homs, on average, are taller than you would actually assume them to be. Because this is something that does not come up in the main game. Yeah, Dionysus works out, can believe he's still sprightly. Yeah, it's just that his model is about the same height, if you were to stand him up, is about the same as Rhine's. But the thing is, the average height of a Homs being taller makes sense because it's never stated in-game specifically. But there are allusions to it, and it's outright confirmed in the Monado archive because it has a timeline that Homs are the descendants of the giants. And we know the giants are very tall, taller than Machina tall. So, and the fact is that, a 6 foot some odd Homs is considered the average height makes sense for something that is descended from something that may have been 12 feet tall on average. So Ryan being a big guy makes sense. Shulk being short, frankly, couldn't tell you why he's short. Might be because he hates his vegetables. Might be because his growth is stunted because insert reasons here. It may just be because he's short. Who knows? Shulk is just a small boy. But then that kind of starts leading into other things about how the Homs are very different from humans and getting into the actual nitty-gritty of it. Because, specifically, not only are Homs descended of giants, and it kind of makes sense from the perspective that the Hyantia can interbreed with Homs, is the fact that Homs and Hyantia share a common ancestor. Yeah, Dixon does say Shulk does spend too much time in the lab, but I feel like his short stature is somewhat only mildly exacerbated by the fact that he stays indoor all the time. I think Shulk was just always small. I think that's his excuse. But back to the previous thing is that Homs are descended from the same thing as the Hyantia, aka they're both related to the Telethia. And we know that Telethia are surprisingly big creatures. And it kind of, lends itself that, eventually down the line, something that is close enough descended-wise can still somewhat interbreed with something also of the same descendant. But bear in mind, I'm a science person, but I'm not a biology major, especially not in terms of animals or actual genealogy and shenanigans like that. Like, I don't actually understand the semantics sometimes, but you have to have somewhat of a common ancestor to be able to interbreed with certain other things. Like, that's why we can have such things as mixtures of donkeys and horses, but you can't mix a rabbit and a hare because they look the same, but they are from such different genealogical paths. So there is that bearing in mind. But again, I'm not a biologist, so a lot of this is vague stuff I do happen to know. But when you kind of get into the point that, all things considered, a Homs is the descendant of a weird bird, dinosaur, dragon creature thing of the gods, calling them non-human is probably more warranted than anything. Because at least amongst a mind-reading giant bird, as Dunban puts it. Also usually comes down to whether said cross between different species can also have children too. Yeah, that is usually a thing that, like, most interbreeds of our world are unable to have further children, but you still get the point. We can at least go into the point that we understand the basics that certain things can breed, certain things cannot. But there's still the overall point that the Homs innately come from the same thing that also created the Telethia. They're just slightly more removed. Which I guess brings up the question, can a giant breed with a Hyantia? They probably could. Let's not think about that one too much in terms of the actual semantics, but given a Homs can, I would imagine the giants can too. Thank you for putting that in my head, me. But I think that's kind of where we start getting into things that are separating the Homs more and more from what would be discerned of our world human and even Alrestian. Because that's the thing, is that the people of Alrest are described as human. Like, I think it's because they don't even have a reliance on ether to survive. Like, ether exists in their world, but it's never explained that they need it. Like, it's more of a thing for the blades, because they interact with it and stuff. And ether is a byproduct of the Titans, but Rex doesn't need ether to survive, while Shulk would literally die without it. And that's one of those things that it's not very clear, other than life force of the Bionis, what the hell ether does. Yeah, it's never explained that humans can interact with it into only blades. Yeah, so it's one of those things that, like, there's also the point that technically a Gormati is human. Like, they're not considered a separate species, they're just a different type of people. Like, they're just a different race of humans. So, like, a Gormati and a Urayan are still human by Alrestian standards. But again, that kind of starts getting into weird territory. But again, described as humans for, like, Rex, Morag, Zeke. The people that don't have any weirdness to them. Yeah, they look similar, but humans and two must be quite different when you get down to it, purely because of ether. Yeah, ether throws in many wrenches. Because that's one of those things that, one of those kind of ideas I've always had in the back of my head is, there is a point in 1, you go inside the Bionis. And inside the Bionis, you see its heart, and kind of the dorsal cavity, and all of the weird acidic goop in there. And there's also the point that it is explained very, very distinctly that the Bionis has 3 lungs, minimum? Because usually for stuff like that, things come in pairs, so it's probably safe to assume the Bionis might even have 4, but I at least say 3 minimum. Like, could be maximum, could be minimum, we don't know. There are 3. So it kind of lends itself to where the Homs made, or at least, the Telethia and then the Giants, then Homs, where they made in the image of the Bionis. So it begs the question, do Homs have more than one set of lungs? I don't want to get too far on this tangent, but the evolutionary tree in Klaus's explanation shows that the humans derive from multiple branches in his circle of life. Yeah, so yeah, that goes into the tangent of 2, and something I would have to put more thought into because I am a 1 expert, or at least I know a lot more about 1 than I do 2. But with the whole thing of 2's or 1's Homs is that very question of how similar is a Homs to the makeup of the Bionis? Like, is that why it is so easy for a Homs to be able to go from Colony 9 to Aerith Sea and even Valak Mountain with very little, well, complications in terms of being able to breathe? Like, it, or even the fact that a Homs can literally swim the entirety of Aerith Sea no problem without worrying about respiration. Like that's one of those questions that kind of comes up when you start thinking about various other things. Is there is no, like, there are other games that you can just swim for forever, but in Xenoblade 1 there is no stamina meter for swimming. In fact, in order to get to certain places in Aerith Sea or Magna Force, you are expected to swim for a long time. But it's still the point that, thinking of Aerith Sea, when you first get there, Ryan and Dunban are having a conversation about how if you dive down far enough into Aerith Sea, you could reach the Napon Tree. You can reach the top of Frontier Village again. But the thing is that Charla obviously is looking disapprovingly at these 2 idiots. But the thing is that, like, there doesn't seem to be a question of whether or not Ryan would be able to hold his breath that long. Like, Ryan seriously considers diving into Aerith Sea just to swim back to Frontier Village. Like, there's no question. He's just like, I might do it. Like, is it just because Ryan's stupid and isn't thinking about the fact that he needs to breathe? Or is just something like that so trivial? Because Definitive does introduce new armor for each of the characters, and Shulk has a snorkel mask, but it's never really been explained whether or not they actually need it, or if that's just a thing. Like, it's kind of implied that at some point, they do need to breathe while swimming. And apparently snorkeling is a thing that they can do. But at what point do they need it? Excuse me. Because that is always something that kind of caught me, is the fact that Ryan and Dunban have a serious discussion about jumping into Aerith Sea and frickin' swimming all the way back to the top of Frontier Village, with no question of whether or not you'd be able to, hold your breath that long. But at the same time, Shulk now has, more or less canonically, a snorkel mask. So I would obviously assume there is some point that they need to breathe while swimming. But, I mean, there are multiple times when they do talk about catching their breath, so they do, yeah, like it is very obvious they need to breathe. That's just kind of a thing. But what is the upper limit before they consider it a problem? Because, like, it's hard to estimate, like, atmospheric air pressure on the Bionis. Like, it doesn't seem like the air is any thinner on Aerith Sea compared to Colony 9, but there may be a density issue with the ether. Could also see that Colony 9 is on a lake. Ryan and Dunban could be confident on their diving ability could be a drill Vanguard makes them do. See, that is plausible. Vanguard does make the Colony 9 Defense Force do some outright ridiculous things. Some of it may be hyperbole, but I would honestly believe that, given some various things that, Rhine, Dunban, various other Colony 9 Defense Force would be able to do some interesting feats. But there's still the point that Shulk, who is more or less outright confirmed to be not out of shape, but, physically the weakest of the Colony 9 Quartet, is still able to keep up with trained soldiers Rhine and Dunban. So it's still a point that, Rhine and Dunban may be upper limit of possibility, but yeah, not fit, but not out of shape. That's a good way of putting it. That those two could, theoretically, go from Lata El Shore, swim all the way through the bottom of Aerith Sea, to probably not get crushed by water pressure, ? And fall back into Apex Lake of Frontier Village, completely fine, and maybe only a little bit out of breath. Shulk probably would struggle even further. Charlotte would probably be able to at least get close compared to Dunban and Rhine, but that's because she's athletic like that. Melia would not even try. Or they missed the tree and died. There is also that point too, but, all things considered, there's still the point that water seems to be the least of their issues, at least in terms of falling, so, point. But it's still, the interesting point that water is something that kind of just adds more questions. Like, how long can they hold their breath? Who knows? I don't. Do you? I don't. And then again, we kind of get into the point that, gems, the ether gems exist and augment certain things for the Homs, like fall defense. And it's already kind of a good point that, apparently, under the right conditions, these guys can fall for miles and live. Like, there is the point that, they have to hit water in order to guarantee survival, and there is some plot armor very late in the game. But there's still the point that the entire party fell from frickin' Mechonis' sword. They fell from nearly the top of the Mechonis down to the fallen arm at sea level and lived. Let's see here. With all the places where atmospheric changes would be drastic in our world, from like Colony 9 to Valak Mountain, I wonder if either has some sort of effect on general atmospheric pressure. That is a good question, mostly because, again, either throws in many questions. Is the fact that we know that concentration of ether varies based on location. In fact, I almost think that it's almost the inverse, where air would be thinner for us higher elevation, air is thinner, quote unquote, comparatively lower on the Bionis due to less ether. Because it is explained that the higher up on the Bionis you go, the more ether there is. So I would actually almost believe it that the higher up they are, the better they are at, certain basic metabolic functions because there's more ether. Like, we don't actually know how ether affects the Homs in any capacity. Like, does it help their breathing? Is it more of a thing that keeps their brains going? Like, is it outright their ability to see, or is it just more or less one of those things that it just affects everything? We don't know. There's also how the Machina have trouble with water. Raxit mentions that he has to worry about drowning whenever he rescues people, which is why he wanted to be a Hom so he could float easier. That is true. And then that leads into many more questions relating to Fiora, because it's like, shouldn't she also sink like a stone? But that's probably a case of gameplay and story segregation, aka Fiora's ability to swim is, for the ability to, in fact keep her a playable character, and also in the fact that she is Hom's prior, so she just knows how to swim. while, Machina probably don't go out of their way to learn. But who knows? But that kind of brings again that there's also the point that, in the real world, people need certain things to be able to survive. Specifically, we need food, water, and certain amounts of other things in order to keep us running. Very specifically, people do need a certain amount of sunlight / vitamin D in order for their body to process things, but also there's a point that people are able to live in places like frickin', northern Finland, and for the most part be fine. Like, they usually get, like, their vitamins and stuff from the things they eat, rather than, the sunlight or lack thereof, because they're so far north in certain times of the year. Meanwhile, it is explained somewhere, and I haven't been able to figure out where it is. I think it's a side quest, very late in the game, that it is outright explained that in order for a Homs to live, they need food, water, and sunlight. And that is why, like, despite the, ample space, there are no Homs living in Valak Mountain or Satoral Marsh. And it's strictly explained because those two places do not get enough sunlight that literally the Homs would die. And I wish I remember where I saw this information, because that is literally something I've never been able to confirm, but I know I've seen it before. Like, I think it's specifically like a side quest, like right after Makana's core. I think that's where it comes from. And that leads to kind of some interesting questions and ideas of where the other Homs colonies had to have been. They had to mostly be relegated to the front and left sides of the Bionis. Like, Colony 9 is probably the most secluded, being on the Bionis' I think, right leg? Yeah, I think the Bionis' right leg. But that means that, like, any other Homs colonies had to have mostly been relegated to the front of the Bionis, or even to, like, its left side. But obviously we'll never know that, but that's why, despite the fact that there's, at least a decent amount of space, that, and, the monsters are probably a good factor of why, that Satoral Marsh has no settlements. Like, the Hyantia used to be there, but then they retreated to Alchemoth once, the Homs came in. Like, apparently they were able to just exist there for some time, but then they just decided to disappear once the Homs came in. And obviously they also existed at Valak, but I think it's explained that the reason the Hyantia left Valak is because it got too cold. Yeah, and there's also the giant ruins in Satoral Marsh as well, which there are also giant ruins inside Tephra Cave, meaning it might be more of a thing that developed later down the line for Homs, that they had to stay in the sunlight, because, to be fair, with the giant ruins, is that mostly their ruins are, like, built before the Bionis stopped moving, meaning that, sunlight was probably more plentiful in certain places, and also that some of the other ruins are specifically tombs, which are more or less specifically like the ones in Tephra Cave and Magna Forest. So really the only Giants ruins, other than Prison Island, which is a moving whatever the hell, and whatever's in Satoral Marsh. It's hard to really discern what exactly the needs were of a giant compared to a Homs. But it's one of those things that kind of starting to get more of the idea that, all things considered, a Homs, like, the best way I've always described it is that technically Homs are alien to us because they are from a different world. They're technically non-human, and various other things that just, once you start getting into the nitty-gritty of it all, they are completely different creatures. Even in the fact that their ancestors are, like, comparatively, humans are, technically we're primates. A Homs is technically bird. Like, the weirdness of it is a Homs is technically more bird than anything. Yeah, a different world that may or may not be flat. Jury's still out. Because that's the other thing, is that the Homs world is really weird. Because there is no sunrise, there is no sunset. The sun just disappears for several hours, and there's no moon, but they know what a moon is. And that one just gives me a headache, frankly. That's going to be fun to talk about when it just annoys you. But another of the things that kind of... yeah. But also, Xanta once being human, it makes sense that he would want some species to become more human-like. I mean, yeah, he definitely put his frickin' godly hand into the mix when he started letting people exist. He probably definitely had some hand in trying to make the Homs as close to human as he could, but certain things would still get out of whack. And they have astrology, which implies that the constellations move. That, and, apparently Homs and Hyantia both have the same names for their constellations. Which that gets into even more weirdness of, like, who taught them the astrology? Is it just a thing that the Homs picked up from Hyantia? Is it just something that they somehow all agreed upon in the ancient past, and it just never derived? And more questions, not enough time. Close that book. We'll talk about it later. But another thing I kind of wanted to bring up is the point that, now this one's a bit more theory-ish, less concrete, is Homs have some apparent natural ability to see pretty well at night, or in darkness. Now bear in mind, there is such a thing as the night vision gem. Specifically the equipment that makes it so you're more accurate at night or in dark caves while fighting. But you can still fight pretty damn well without it. And there are certain points where you're, like, wandering around, like, frickin' Central Factory. That's not Central Factory. The Ether Mine in Colony 6, and some dark places in other areas, and even, middle of the night, or frankly more like middle of the day, in a blizzard in frickin' Valak Mountain. And these guys still manage to, hold their own. Again, maybe a case of gameplay, being able to do that, but all things considered, like, there's a decent amount of natural light in open spaces, like, Colony 6, Colony 9, Bionis Lake. They have a lot of the natural starlight. But once you start getting into, like, the little odd and end caves and places, how the hell are they able to see? Because once it reaches a certain level of darkness out here, God, you can't see a thing. But yet, that doesn't seem to bother, the party too much. Because, like, all things considered, I'd actually venture to say certain places in the Maconis are actually very dark. Because, machines don't, need as much light, and 90% of Maconis is interior. So just, like, are their eyes specifically designed to see better in certain light conditions? Like, they need light to live. So obviously, they're not nocturnal, but there's still the point that they can function at night. But at the same time, hum-based mines like the Ether Mine are artificially... Yeah, no, they still need light. Like, Charlotte explains that her first job was racing Gatto, and that was specifically because they were refilling ether lights in the mine. But that's probably to help with some of the fact that they were working with, heavy machinery and intricate things that they needed the fine-tuning of as much light as possible. But the fact is, if Charla and Gatto are racing to change the light, it means that there's probably a lot of patches where it is just insanely dark. Bearing in mind that, the Ether Mine does have the glow moss. But all things considered, the very central area of Ether Mine is kind of dark. Like, it has some artificial light, but because it's got that giant turbine, most of the light is coming from the Ether River. And I did say that most of this kind of gets more into the theory territory, because I don't have much to back up any of these ideas. But the fact is, night vision gems kind of help with something that is only a minor problem? Question mark? Because, there's things like fall defense, which, you'll still take a decent amount of damage from falling, but it just means you can fall for slightly longer and not die. But eventually they'll still die of fall damage. Or like the fact that, if you get enough skill ranks on Shulk, he becomes outright immune to like certain debuffs. And just like, how does that work? I don't know. I mean, it's already weird enough that they're able to, like, Shulk is able to utilize Ether in just enough of a way that he can heal himself. And it's never explained what light heal is, I think. But then there's also the fact that they can utilize aura. Yeah, they become immune to death. But, like, that's something that I hadn't even touched upon yet, is, Ether utilization and auras. Like, Shulk is a little less reliant on them, but I think every other person in the party has at least one aura, with I think the other exception being Melia. I don't think she has any aura either, but she doesn't really need it. But like Sharla has an aura. Brian and Dunban rely on them very heavily. Ricky has one, and Fiora I think has a couple as well, but only in Machina form. So it's just like, what the heck is an aura? How does it work? I don't know. Because, again, that kind of starts getting into, again, the weird intricacies that make them different. Like, Dunban literally can create an aura around him that completely negates all aggro. Like, enemies just instantly forget he's there. A single aura that extends the range of elemental buffs. Fair enough. But, like, both Ryan and Dunban also have an aura that, if activated at the right time, they come back from death. Like, what the hell? Charla's has covert stance, which is less an actual aura and more just a way she fights instead. But then Shulk doesn't have really aura abilities, but he still has something like Shadow Eye, where he is able to mask his presence a little bit. Not as well as Dunban, but he's able to make enemies just kind of somewhat forget he's there. Yeah, not come back from death, they heal themselves. Yeah, there's also that, because, like, they get a certain amount of their health back, they refill their talent gauges. Like, what the hell are auras? How do they work? Like, an attack makes them stronger again. Dunban has ultra powerful aura of disappearing while in plain sight. Yeah, he literally has the hilarious one. While Ryan, he has mad taunt and also, rage and other things that is just like, pay attention to me. He just exudes literally an aura of fight me. While Dunban here is either able to make himself faster, focus himself, heal himself if he were to die. Like, aura certainly is something that sets the Homs apart from, well, being human. Sorry. But I think that also kind of gets into the point that, apparently, much like you would actually expect, it's never explained how, but apparently, there are also certain diseases and stuff for the Homs. Like, the only time we ever get a mention of that is that Dunban has apparently been sick before, and Fjord food to make him feel better. Like, obviously, there's certain aspects of that. It's just like, yeah, no, that makes sense. Like, disease will always exist, no matter the form. But it's like, all things considered, a Hom's cold would probably kill a human. Because, certain aspects of our bodies would be different enough. Maybe. Because, all things considered, considering the fact that Homs need ether to survive at all, they probably have something in their body somehow that helps process it. Because, that's how anything works. You have to have specific systems in your body to process anything. Like, our blood processes, our blood and lungs process oxygen, our stomachs process food, stuff like that. So it's just like, they have to have something in some capacity that processes ether, which part of me feels that it's probably something that is in their blood. Like, similar to the hemoglobin of red blood cells, they probably have some sort of enzyme or something that takes the ether, acknowledges it, and then further processes it so they can live. How it works? I don't know. Ether is a very weird thing in the real world. One of my favorite things about actual real world ether is, long time ago, it used to be used as anesthetic. So it's, at least for humans, kind of intoxicating. They also mentioned that you require ether to live, but that's considered different from food since Fiora doesn't need to eat. Yeah, like, that's the other thing, is that the Machina need water and ether to survive, but not food. So it's like, ether is technically a secondary fuel source. So it's like, it has to be processed in such a way that there's certain, like, enzymes or something that ether is probably, like, this is something I've made a joke of before, that it's probably more like, how, like, plants have, like, chlorophyll, or even similarly, fat cells. Like, it's probably more of like a semi-long-term energy storage. Since, it's needed to live, and, if they don't get enough ether, it is explained that they start feeling nauseous, and eventually, they'll just, pass out. I have imagined that they can just chug one from the canisters of Holder. Calling it a night. Yeah, like, we don't ever get the notion of ether overdose, just ether deficiency, and that's only Melia. But, like, Charlotte does mention that one of the first signs of ether deficiency is nausea. So it's like, it has to be, some sort of secondary energy to that. Which is probably the exact reason why they need sunlight to live, is because not only is it something for the minor vitamins and stuff that humans need, ether itself can only be processed through light. I would think that if it would be blood related, since they can absorb it into their skin. There is that, because that's the other thing that always kind of interests me, I suppose. Excuse me. I guess that it does answer a bit of it, since Charlotte healed that by shooting the ether. Yeah, like, it is absorbed, somewhat of bloodstream-ish, since, it's just in the air. But that's the other thing, is that Homs are apparently, supposedly, a lot, like, more sensitive to poison. Because that's the thing, is that, there are such things as, toxic swamps for us here, where, you probably don't want to stand in it. Like, but if you have, like, certain protective measures, or, like, you could probably stick your hand in a very muddy bog full of who knows what, and you won't immediately get sick or anything. Like, it won't just go through your skin. You might get, like, a rash or something, but you're not gonna die from it. But if you have, like, Shulk stand even, like, an inch inside the poison water of Satoral Marsh, he will just straight up die. Like, it takes, a little while. But he would just straight up die of poison. Like, apparently, like, Homs are susceptible very, very heavily to, like, toxins going through their skin. Like, obviously there's also the ether rivers, but those are explained to be insanely hot. So that's more you're just kind of boiling them alive than anything, actively toxic. Because, there's also, the poison debuff, but, that's damage over time, expected of, poison. And eventually that can, clear itself up because battle mechanics and blah, 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 blah. But there's still the point that you go to Satoral Marsh, stand in a poison bog with, like, only 2 feet, or, like, 2 inches in, and just give it, like, 20 minutes 20 minutes in game time, and they're just dead. Like, I get video game hazard shenanigans, but, like, how does that work? Like, all things considered, that is kind of frightening that just like, in universe, knowing that standing or even sticking your hand in a poison bog could just kill you. Because apparently, it just goes right through their skin. But yet, the frogs are fine, but those are frogs. They're just, big old frogs. Somewhat toxic. Who knows? Yeah, but the fumes don't do it. Yeah, I guess that's the other question is, like... But then again, I don't think it's ever really explained if the toxic swamps of Satoral smell like anything or produce much, like... I mean, obviously it would, but, maybe it's more that, like, their lungs and stuff, like, their respiratory system is better built for stuff like that, but, you wouldn't want to stick your hand in it because, all things considered, even humans, our skin is kind of very sensitive and stuff can seep into it. Like, especially liquids. Like, that's why we get all wrinkly in water for too long. But the fact is, I could probably still stick my hand in a dirty, Louisianan bog, and I probably wouldn't die. It almost makes me think that in general, Homs absorb things through their skin much more easily than humans, which honestly might make them absorb stuff like sunlight more easily. Yeah, which I understand, somewhat of it being just the graphics of the time, but all things considered, in kind of a generalized sense, the Homs of Xeno 1, slightly less of definitive because art style, textures being muddy, blah 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 blah. The Homs are overall slightly darker skinned. Now, bearing in mind Shulk is still pale, like, apparently he gets very... Like, when Shulk doesn't get enough sunlight, he's described as pasty, as in, that boy is, like, very, very pale. And he's also blonde, Fiora's blonde, stuff like that. Like, they have, differences, but there's still the point that overall, the Homs have, in general, a slightly darker complexion comparatively. Meaning, probably they do absorb things better through sunlight. Yeah, but Shulk is a shut-in, so he doesn't set a good example. Exactly. But, like, Fiora, she is of similar caliber to Shulk, but kind of with the weirdness in the fact that it's hard to explain her because Dunban. Like, she's got blonde hair, green eyes, slightly paler complexion, and then Dunban has dark skin, dark hair, gray eyes. What is his deal compared to hers? Who knows? And then there's Rhine, who is one of only 2 redhead characters in the entire game. The other being Colonel Vanguard. And even then, in definitive, Rhine has more brown hair than red. But, like, his hair is supposed to be kind of a weird reddish-orange. But point stands. So, overall, lots of questions, not many answers, but basically the end result of the conversation is a Homs a human? Hell no. Like, just straight up the answer to that question is no. Like, in no capacity. But Anyway, I haven't quite decided yet what the next topic for this is going to be. And I think maybe next time I might bring in like a different co-com, like I said, my usual co-com. He's playing Mario Party today. Let him have some fun. But next time I might bring in someone else as a guest. Don't know yet. We shall see. Haven't determined yet what the hell to talk about. I'll find something. There's many questions to be answered. But I do upload these onto my main channel. So if you ever want to listen back or provide more input that you think about later, this will be uploaded, I believe, on Tuesday of this coming week. And generally, I'll probably keep these uploads, or the actual podcast itself, to like the third Sunday of a month. Some exception may apply, but for the most part, this will be like third Sunday. But for the most part, I do hope you enjoyed today. I do enjoy the points that y'all were bringing up, as well as just in general having the discussion. But I do hope you all have a nice day, and we will see you all next time. And have a good evening.